The bank manager's office smelled like old leather and decisions that couldn't be unmade. Sarah sat across from him on a Tuesday morning in March, her hands folded on the desk in front of her, and listened to him say something that made no sense. He was asking her for advice, not about her debt, not about the farm, about how to help other families who were drowning in the same way she had been drowning for the last 3 years. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry, so she did neither. She just sat there in that quiet office with the afternoon light coming through the windows, and she thought about her father, and she thought about the 800 acres that had nearly destroyed her, and she thought about the moment when everything changed. But that moment hadn't come from the bank. It hadn't come from the government. It had come from something much smaller and much more powerful than either of those things. 3 years earlier, Sarah had been standing in this same bank, but everything was different. Her father had died 6 weeks before, and she was still wearing the black dress from the funeral. The bank manager at that time was a different man, older, with the kind of face that had delivered bad news so many times it had become his permanent expression. He had laid out the papers in front of her with the careful precision of someone handling something fragile. Her father's debts, equipment loan, land mortgages, operating expenses that had accumulated over years of bad weather and worse luck. The numbers didn't seem real. They seemed like something from a different person's life, a different family's tragedy. 800 acres. That was what her father had left her. 800 acres of red clay and oak trees and fences that needed mending, and a barn that was slowly collapsing into itself. He had also left her a name. The Brennan name meant something in that county. It meant hard work. It meant integrity. It meant a family that had worked that land for 4 generations. But it also meant debt. Debt that her father had accumulated trying to keep the farm alive while the world changed around him in ways he couldn't control and wouldn't accept. Sarah had been living in Charlotte when her father died. She had a job in marketing. She had an apartment with air conditioning and a view of the city. She had a life that had nothing to do with farming or land or the weight of family legacy. But she had also been the only child, and when the will was read, everything came to her. The land, the debt, the name, the responsibility. She had quit her job and moved back to the farm within a month, not because she wanted to, because she had to. Because letting the bank take the land would have meant letting her father's life mean nothing. It would have meant that 4 generations of work and sacrifice and early mornings and late nights would be erased by a single bad decade. She couldn't do that. She didn't know how to farm, but she knew how to work. She knew how to be stubborn. She knew how to be a Brennan. The first year was a blur of learning and failing and learning again. She hired a farm manager, an older man named Tom, who had worked for her father for 30 years. He taught her how to read the land, how to understand what the soil needed, how to listen to the seasons. She learned to wake up before dawn. She learned the smell of hay and the sound of cattle lowing in the distance. She learned that farming wasn't romantic. It was brutal and beautiful and exhausting in equal measure. But the debt was always there. Every month, the payments came due. Every month, she had to choose between fixing the roof on the barn and paying the bank, between buying feed for the cattle and paying the bank, between keeping the lights on in the farmhouse and paying the bank. She was working 18-hour days and still falling behind. The numbers didn't add up. They never added up. By the end of the first year, she had sold off some of the equipment. By the end of the second year, she had sold off some of the land. Not much. Just enough to keep the bank from foreclosing, just enough to keep breathing. But each time she sold a piece of the farm, she felt like she was selling a piece of her father's legacy. She felt like she was failing. There was a moment, about 2 years in, when she seriously considered walking away. She was sitting in the farmhouse kitchen at 3 in the morning, drinking cold coffee and looking at the bills spread out on the table, and she thought about how easy it would be to just let it go. To sign the papers and walk away and go back to Charlotte and pretend that none of this had ever happened. No one would blame her. Everyone in town knew that she was fighting an impossible battle. Everyone knew that the farm was dying. But then she heard something. It was a sound she had heard 1,000 times before. But it hit her differently that night. It was the wind moving through the fields. Just the wind. Just the sound of air moving through grass and corn in the open spaces between the fences, and she thought about her father hearing that same sound. She thought about her grandfather. She thought about all the people who had stood in that kitchen and listened to that same wind and decided to keep fighting. So she kept fighting. She didn't know what else to do. If you're watching this and you know what it feels like to inherit something that feels too heavy to carry, I want you to know that you're not alone. Stories like this one connect people from farms and ranches and small towns all across this country. So take a moment and tell us where you're watching from. Tell us your story, because sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is simply acknowledge that we're not the only ones carrying this weight. The turning point came from an unexpected place. It came from a woman named Margaret who lived 3 miles down the road. Margaret was a widow, about the same age as Sarah's mother would have been if she were still alive. She had lost her own farm 15 years earlier. She had lost it to the same kind of debt, the same kind of bad luck, the same kind of world that didn't care about family legacy or hard work or the weight of 4 generations of sacrifice. Margaret showed up at the farm one morning with a casserole and a proposition. She had been watching Sarah work. She had seen her out in the fields at dawn and still working when the sun went down. She had seen her struggle and fail and get back up and try again. And Margaret had decided that she couldn't watch it happen anymore without doing something about it. She brought other people with her, not all at once, but gradually. A neighbor who knew about sustainable farming practices, a woman from the church who had connections to agricultural grants, a man who worked at the county extension office, a retired banker who understood debt restructuring. They didn't come to save Sarah. They came to work alongside her. They came because they understood what it meant to fight for something that mattered. Margaret started coming to the farm every Tuesday. She would bring food and she would work. She would help with the cattle. She would help with the fences. She would sit on the porch in the evening and talk about her own farm, about the mistakes she had made, about the things she had learned too late. She became something like a mother to Sarah. Not a replacement for the mother Sarah had lost years before, but a presence, a witness, someone who understood. The others came too. The neighbor taught Sarah about crop rotation and soil health. The woman from the church helped her apply for grants that she didn't even know existed. The banker sat down with her and helped her restructure the debt in a way that actually made sense. They didn't solve the problem, but they made it possible to see a solution. Sarah started implementing changes. She diversified the crops. She started raising heritage breed cattle that commanded higher prices. She began agritourism ventures, farm stays, and educational workshops that brought in income during the off-season. She worked with the county to establish the farm as a conservation easement, which brought tax benefits and protected the land from development. Each change was small, but together they added up. By the end of the 3rd year, something remarkable had happened. The farm was no longer drowning. It was still struggling. It would probably always struggle, but it was viable. It was sustainable. It was a place where Sarah could imagine a future. And then the bank manager called her in. The new bank manager, the one who was sitting across from her now, asking her for advice. He explained that the bank had been watching what she had done. They had been impressed by her resilience and her creativity and her willingness to adapt. They wanted to create a program to help other farmers who were in the same situation she had been in. They wanted Sarah to help design it. They wanted her to be the face of it. They wanted her to tell her story to other families who were drowning in debt and didn't know how to swim. Sarah listened to him explain the program, and she thought about Margaret sitting on the porch. She thought about the neighbor teaching her about soil. She thought about the banker restructuring her debt. She thought about all the small acts of kindness and wisdom that had saved her farm, and she realized something important. The bank hadn't saved her. The government hadn't saved her. She had saved herself, but she hadn't done it alone. She told the bank manager yes, she would help, but not because the bank was asking, because Margaret had shown her what it meant to help someone carry a weight that felt too heavy to carry alone, because the neighbor had shown her that knowledge shared was knowledge multiplied, because the banker had shown her that sometimes the system could be bent to serve people instead of destroying them. Over the next year, Sarah worked with the bank to create a program that connected struggling farmers with mentors, with resources, with community. It wasn't a handout. It was a hand up. It was a way of saying that you don't have to do this alone, that the weight you're carrying doesn't have to crush you, that there are people who understand, that there is a way forward. Sarah still works the farm. She still wakes up before dawn. She still listens to the wind moving through the fields. But now she also spends time helping other farmers navigate the same path she walked. She has become what Margaret was to her, a witness, a guide, a person who understands that sometimes the most important thing you can do is simply show up and work alongside someone who is struggling. The 800 acres are still there. There's still red clay and oak trees and fences that need mending. But they're no longer a burden. They're a legacy. They're a place where Sarah learned what it meant to be strong. They're a place where she learned that strength isn't about doing everything alone. It's about knowing when to ask for help. It's about being willing to accept it. It's about understanding that we're all connected, that we all need each other, that the weight we carry is lighter when we carry it together. If this story touched your heart, if it reminded you of someone you know or someone you've been, please take a moment to leave a like. Share this video with someone who understands the value of hard work and family legacy and the power of community. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Tell us your story, because stories like these remind us that we're not alone in this world, that there are people out there who understand, that there is always a way forward, even when the path seems impossible.